Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to WALPA Day 2 and your live streaming conference. I hope you are coffeeed up and got to the breakfast bar in the hotel lobby. Oh, wait, not happening this year. Hope you've got your snacks and are ready to settle in. I'm Avery Shinneman, a professor at the University of Washington Bothel campus in the Earth Systems Science program. And this morning with Jim Gawel from UW Tacoma, we're going to start with a discussion about public access to lakes. And this discussion, Jim and I were talking about this at least since the last WALPA, a little bit about what we know about public access points, their actual accessibility, their value, their use. And then the summer came around, and I'm sure as many of you experienced, our parks and beaches and trailheads were absolutely swamped with people looking for a place to socialize and stay cool while all the buildings with air conditioning were closed. And so it became really apparent how many people are trying to use that public space a lot of times all at the same time. So what we wanted to do this morning was have a discussion as best we can in this format, really within WALPA. What do we know about public access at lakes? What do we wish we knew? We had started that discussion yesterday in the plenary, a little bit about how much data we lack about where those public access points are, where the points are relative to different neighborhoods in different parts of the state. So we just kind of want to open up to thinking about some of those points and have a discussion that ranges across lots of different things about those public access points, what we know about them, what we don't, what we should. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists for this morning and ask them to go around and introduce themselves a bit. And as we do that, I'll remind you that any questions that you have as we go, you can submit to info@walpa.org, and we'll bring those into the discussion from our end. So moving around the screen, you'll know Jim, no doubt, I think on your upper left there, from UW Tacoma. We have Ashley Towns, who is a graduate student at the University of Washington, but also here representing an organization called Link to Lake, which is trying to work with some public access and parks recreation creation in the Rainier Beach neighborhood in Seattle. She's on your upper right there. Daniel Nigzgorski from King County Lakes and Streams Assessment, and Marissa Bergdorf down next to me here from Snohomish County and the Lakewise program. So I was going to start with is asking each of you to go around and just introduce a bit about yourself. Maybe I was going to ask you for your favorite lake. What is your favorite lake, or maybe lake thing to do, whatever it might be. And then introduce your organization, particularly as it pertains to public access. So we'll start with, let's start with Daniel.
All right. Thank you, Avery. So I'm an ecologist working with King County Department of Natural Resources. We work on a lot of different projects. The ones that I'm going to be talking about here mostly are our swimming beach monitoring on Lake Washington and other lakes in King County for bacteria from poop pollution, and also our toxic algae, which I know is near and dear to a lot of your hearts. My favorite lake is a small lake in the Cascades that I won't name because I'm trying to keep it from getting overrun like everything else is.
Great, thank you. How about Ashley?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Ashley Towns, and I am a Ph.D. student at the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. But I'm also a proud resident of the Rainier Beach neighborhood. And I joined this fantastic committee organization called Rainier Beach Link to Lake, where our primary mission is to create a civic commercial corridor between the Rainier Beach link station to Beersheba Park, which is a waterfront park. And our objectives are really to try to improve it and to up the standards of the park. And I'll be talking a little bit about the lack of amenities and inequities that we are illuminating at the current time. Thanks so much.
Thanks. And Marissa.
Hi, thanks for having me this morning. I'm Marissa Bergdorf, as Avery mentioned, from Snohomish County, and I work in the lake management program, which I'm still thrilled that we have a lake management program, but we get to work on all sorts of projects. Primarily, we have a volunteer lake monitoring program, so we interact a lot with lake residents through that program. We also work on a variety of lake management activities, including toxic algae monitoring, invasive aquatic plant control, and our Lake-Wise outreach program. And a lot of times we also just get lots and lots of phone calls from lake area residents and users. So we can bring that perspective of what their concerns are today.
And Jim?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jim Gawel. I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Also a past president and board member on WALPA for a number of years. And my research actually is on lakes and toxics in lakes, as well as harmful algae blooms and effects of nutrients, both around here in the sort of Puget Sound region lakes, as well as at Mount St. Helens and other places. So I have a lot of interest in sort of the effect of toxics on people and on organisms, and therefore trying to figure out who those people are that are potentially affected, which is actually not necessarily very well known. So I'm really interested in that stuff. As far as my favorite lake goes, that's an awfully political question when somebody does a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm going to name one out of state just because I remember it fondly. So Walden Pond outside of Boston, because it was the closest place you could actually go swimming during the heat of Boston summers. Everything else was a water supply. So you actually had to drive about an hour in traffic to get to a lake to be able to swim. So I remember it quite well.
That's actually my my impetus for asking the question, because I put up as my background here Lake Phelan in St. Paul, Minnesota, which was the local public lake to where I grew up. And when I moved here, the St. Paul, Minneapolis metro area, there is no private ownership of waterfront. So there's like 8 lakes or so and the Mississippi River water frontage and several large creeks, and all of that is publicly owned and accessible within the city. So moving to Seattle was kind of a shock for me. And there's looking at these little teeny pocket parks on Lake Washington that are 15 feet of shoreline, and calling that a public access point was a little bit of a change of perspective. So I'll actually open with a question around that. One of the things we talked about yesterday was the data access, and I undoubtedly across the WALPA membership that's out there, there's more data points available than we have in one spot. So that may be a place that we could do some work to kind of gather data on this. But just reaching out to King County, there was not some immediately accessible data set on how many lakes even have public access points or do not have public access points. So I did get from Chris Knutson the subset of their lake stewardship lakes, just as an example set, and that's 38 lakes, 14 of which have no public access at all. And then that leaves 24 with some public access, but a little more than a third of those, the public access is only a concrete boat ramp. So there's no, nothing if you don't have a boat, basically. So it's public access as long as you're a member of the public who owns a boat and a boat trailer. And so I wanted to start, kick off by asking Ashley a little bit about, when we're thinking about promoting access to lakes, what are those amenities that that we need to make it safe and accessible and usable for the public, and where are we lacking with that?
Yes, well, on the south end, and like I was telling you all in my little introduction, that we are trying to illuminate the inequities at Bear Shepherd Park, which is a waterfront park, and basically those basic standards or those basic amenities such as lights, fixtures, such as places to gather in regards to having benches and seating arrangements, and also structures that will help us hang out in areas where when it starts to rain or whatever, like like shelters for seasonal use. Those are the things that we are lacking that would really up the use of Bear Shepherd Park. I mean, it's a relatively large, beautiful glenned park that is just definitely not taken into consideration or by the public, or the composition of the neighborhood is incredibly diverse. They're not very aware that this is actually a park because of these lack of amenities, these basic things. And when you start to do an informal study around Seattle and go up to the north end, they have a lot of amenities, a lot of furnishings, the upkeep That's something too, as being a fisheries ecologist, I start to look at the riparian buffers and look at the vegetation and invasive species, and that's definitely being taken over. It's a monster here, and it's that neglect. And it's something in regards to, amenities mean that you have the proper money and funding to just be proudful of this space, right? There's no money going into our park. It's not on the priority list for us to get these basic things. So those are really the 4 basic things that we're really fighting for, which is quite sad. And I must tell you all that last 3 weeks ago, we had a 1-hour meeting with Jane Durkin to talk about these inequities and these basic furnishings that we're trying to get funding for, and to just really elevate the voices of our residents. We are in the 98118 zip code of Rainier Beach is not one of the most, I have to demystify that, it's not one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the country, but for how small it is, it's incredibly a melting pot. And what I want to say about that is that culture is embedded into natural spaces and how we utilize the park, right? In regards to taking strolls, in regards to praying or reflecting. And we already know that, the neurochemicals start flowing when we are by water. It's science, right? And that's a shame because we have these unnecessary obstacles and the lack of amenities where we're not able to use this beautiful park that's right in our space. So that's what Link the Lake is really doing, and trying to increase our empirical evidence, really expose it with visuals, also getting the input of how people utilize the space. We asked them directly, do you know this is a park? And high percent of people didn't even know. I have to just reiterate that. And so really creating a corridor and also being aware that there is a park, right? So we talk about signage. That's also kind of a amenity, having public signage, some sort of access point to get to the shorelines, and also to expand it. When you look at the definition of a waterfront park, you have trails, you have distinguished walkways. We don't really have that at all. So that's what we're fighting for. And those are the amenities that I wanted to share with you all that are quite important that we're lacking at the Bear Share Park in South Seattle.
Thank you for that excellent example. I'll ask the other panelists if they have things to add in a second, but also just want to remind people watching that you can email in questions for Ashley specifically or in general, or if you have examples that seem similar or other things to share from other parks around the state, feel free to send those in as well, and we'll share them out here. So any other panelists want to add on to that?
I'll throw something in there. So one of the things that I found, I think the interesting thing about doing research at lakes, or any of us who are actually spending quite a bit of time around lakes, is that we end up knowing more about the lakes sometimes than the lake residents do. It's interesting because when I was doing research in Boston on a quite contaminated lake, we were meeting with the lake homeowners about the situation in the lake, and they were aware of what was going on, and they said, oh, well, nobody here eats the fish out of this lake, so it's not an issue. I said, I actually spend quite a bit of time during the day on weekdays out there, and there are always people out there fishing, and they're taking them home. And they're not taking them home to mount them, because that's not the kind of fish you get out of that lake. So I think there's that interesting idea that people are using these lakes and they're almost invisible sometimes to the folks that we often talk to. So that's always been, I think, an issue with getting information about lakes and lake users, is that we go to the people that we know that live on the lake. And that's a very different population than the rest of the folks who actually rely on that lake, who don't have the money to live on it. So I think it's really a big piece of that is trying to figure out who uses it, what do they want to use it for, just getting in touch with those folks. There's not a set way, I've been looking into that recently, there's not a set way to get that information from people if you don't know who they are. So.
Great, and that actually leads into the second question that I wanted to put out, maybe first to Daniel, because of your work on the swimming beaches. But What do you think, as we consider public access points, what is that key information that needs to be conveyed primarily for the health of the people using that swimming beach or using that lake, and where are the barriers to getting that out?
All right. So we think a lot about how we say stuff, language, where to say it, signage, website, but the most important thing is focusing on what to say. As scientists or scientifically minded people, we tend to start with context, information, education. Skip all that. People need to know what to do. They need actionable recommendations. So anything when we have to issue a warning or a closure, we start really simply with what's going on, either toxic algae in lake, high bacteria levels, and then do not swim. If you're not telling people an actionable recommendation, but you're kind of making a direction, it's not going to be very helpful. We were surveying swimming beaches across the country to see if they had kind of a warning in between open and closed. And a lot of them had something really vague like, oh, bacteria levels are kind of elevated. Maybe kids or older people should exercise some caution. And when we talked to our beach managers here and to public health, they said those things are useless because you're not telling people what to do. You're not saying like people over 65 should not swim or something. And those vague statements just create a lot more confusion than they do help. So clear, actionable recommendations are the most important thing that people need to know what to do or not to do to keep themselves, their families, their pets safe. Along those lines is how to interpret and apply things to other areas. So we monitor a number of beaches on Lake Washington that are more of the official public lifeguarded beaches. And there are all these other parks and swimming spots, private shorelines, everything else in between. And people always want to say, well, that beach here is closed. That one's okay. I live here. What am I supposed to do? And for poop pollution in a big lake like Lake Washington, we know that that can be extremely local. Sometimes we've had a beach with screamingly high bacteria values, and we sampled a couple houses down to see where it's coming from, and that had amazingly good water quality. So trying to tell people, no, the whole lake isn't closed, a lot of that other stuff, because we're trying to make recommendations about one beach, and they're trying to ask about their favorite park or their shoreline a little bit ways. So that's really what to say, is telling people what they need to know and realizing that that can have a lot of different layers to it. When you get into how to say it, I won't go into a whole workshop here on plain language, but things like saying toxic algae instead of cyanobacteria, actually saying poop instead of fecal contamination. Yes, I have said poop on TV, radio, newspaper interviews, scientific conferences, because it's what people understand. And then once you have a simple, plain language message, can you translate that into other languages? For many of us in Washington, that's English and Spanish at a minimum. In King County, we have a set of 10 languages we try to use for our key messages. And also considering culture. Public health has a great example where they had to cancel their swine flu vaccination campaign a few years ago because people are like, why are you going to inject me with something from pigs? It didn't cross cultures very well. And then once you have your message, getting it out to the public can be hard. We rely a lot on signage. That only works at public access points. So considering the private users, the unofficial access points, all of that can be trickier. And we know that people will still just somehow walk right past a sign without seeing it. We've even had people who, they set up at a beach, they hang their sweatshirt on something, and we say, excuse me, the beach is closed. You didn't see the sign? Well, that thing you hung your sweatshirt on was the beach closed sign. You can only do so much. We also try to get a lot out through websites and emails, and that gets really tricky because there's layers of city and county. Ashley's Beersheba Park is a really interesting example. Last summer, it was closed for a bit because of some sewer work that was just contaminating the area. And the city's website for the park never had information about the closure. It's not designed to be updated rapidly like that. On our county swimming beach monitoring page, we put a courtesy notice about that, even though it's not one of our monitored ones. But there's oftentimes you get that kind of mishmash where like our website says something is closed, the city's website about the park doesn't say anything. I've had people call in and say, well, the sign says it's closed, but the website doesn't, so I'm just going to let my kids swim. And oh, goodness. So we have, in some senses, too much conflicting information, and in other senses, not enough. People always want more. You know, can you notify everyone who lives in the area? Can you put more signs? And I don't have any clear answers for that bit, except to just listen and try to understand that every park, every community is going to have different ways that they can receive the information. So yeah, just what to say, how to say it, where to say it can all be tricky. We know kind of from that scientific basis what we want to recommend, but then the layers of translating it into do not swim, getting that out to where people can hear it is always a lot harder.
Did Ashley, Marissa, Jim have any follow-up comment on those communication strategies?
I do. This really resonates with me because for two reasons, especially talking about the different cultural elements in signage and having the skill to cross-communicate with different cultures and audiences in order to connect that information, that content, important content such as, warning signs for when and when not to swim. And the reason is because this resonates with me because I attended Tufts University and I was a rower. And before that, at a point in my life, I wasn't sure that I belonged by water. It's a weird thing to think about now, being older. But it was something about the signage that my mom thought I had the opportunity to be part of a rowing team when I was 12 years old in Philadelphia. I'm from Philadelphia. And it was something about the signage. And the signage actually had an African-American girl holding an oar. So it was that visual effect. But also on top of that, layered on top of that, it was the language. How it was broken down, like Daniel said, scientific words and definitions. I mean, that doesn't really sometimes compute to people. They don't know how to interpret it. They don't know what it is. It also discourages people, say poop. We know what that is. But yeah, just being very delicate with language and having different sets of lexicons, right? And when to use them appropriately. I think that's something that's definitely not done enough. And also how information is disseminated. Daniel said, our website wasn't updated. First of all, not everyone has internet access. People are old school like me. I mean, I still write letters. I still do the door-to-door knocking. I'm still a fan of having, informational seminars or informational gatherings in the park, handing out flyers, something tangible people can hold. But again, it's those have that sort of creative aspect when you're trying to create a message and how you're going to get that message across is incredibly important. A lot of times, a lot of officials miss the mark on that, and it's quite sad. But yeah, that was an excellent point, Daniel. That really resonated.
And for what Ashley's talking about with a lot of that getting messages out to the communities, one, it's communities plural. Anywhere we're talking about, as Jim mentioned, even the people who live around a lake and the people who fish there every day may be completely different groups of folks. But none of us is going to have the skills to magically reach every community. If you have a good communications partner, work with them, but the communities can be your partners. Reach out to folks. If you've got a group, say you're working the Rainier Beach neighborhood, reach out to a group like Ashley's and be prepared to hire them for their expertise in working with you on this, because they're going to know what reaches their community and how, way better than any of us or any surveys could. So I think those community partnerships are really the best way to co-create messages for your community.
I might add a little bit to that as well. So first, I would just say thank you to King County for leading the way in especially the toxic algae signage and the toxic algae website and making that more accessible. We've been able to adopt yours and use that, so it's been really helpful. I think I might add of getting the message out, a tool that's been really helpful for us, especially because in Snohomish County, most of our lakes that we work with closely are in rural areas. So it's somewhat different issues of accessibility and the communities you're working with. But we've really found Nextdoor to be a really helpful tool to be able to get the message out there, especially to those lake users as opposed to the lake residents. So we've had really good response. I think of just raising overall awareness, especially with toxic algae, that this is a problem and to be aware of it so they may be looking or thinking about using that signage. And it's also been just a good visibility or way to increase knowledge of that lakes are around there. So if they're receiving notices about a toxic algae alert, it also keys the person into that, there are those researchers out there, although they might not be the best message if you're saying don't go there right now. And I think one thing I might add, and it kind of builds on the last comment, is that this summer has been, I think, a real shift in the demand and pressure for lakes, which and I think in a lot of ways is great because we've had more people that are seeing our website. We have web page for each of our public lakes that gives all the information and the accessibility and whether there's parks or boat launches. And we've had more people call. We keep a call than ever, trying to find out where the lakes are. Is it safe to swim? Is it safe to fish? So I think that's probably a little bit more looking into the future.
Great. And I have a follow up on that. The way all of you are talking about reaching out to different communities, one of the things that Jim and I have talked about that prompted this is how hard it is to figure out who you're talking to. I'm curious if anyone here or really anyone in the WALPA audience also have seen good ways to get a good handle on who the users are. What if you're talking about lake residents, but then also looking at frequent fishers, at frequent swimmers, at people who want to stroll and picnic by the lake. How do we best figure out who each of those groups are so that we can go about communicating with them?
There was one summer we had an intern who just spent some weekdays, some weekend days out at a beach and actually counted noses and surveyed people. We certainly know that it's not just the people who live around a lake or a public access point who use it, so don't mistake your census maps for your lake users. But yeah, just taking the time and being there and realizing that different people will use the lake at different times of day, different days of week. I don't think there's any real substitute for that on the ground. And yes, unfortunately, there's a lot of lakes and not enough of us to do that all well.
I'm not a representative of this, but I'm pretty sure Fish and Wildlife does their surveys to understand catch. So perhaps there's an element there that could be used as a tool to understand the lake users better, potentially.
I think to Marissa's point, I think they do some of that, but unfortunately they do it mostly on really hotspot like fishing areas. So it tends to be a lot on the rivers actually, and on some of the bigger lakes. So they actually, because we've been trying to find that lately, and it's pretty sparse on most of the small lakes that in urban areas and such. It tends to be big on what we consider to be big like angler lakes. So they do those creel surveys and things along those lines, which are really useful. But again, it's one agency trying to cover all of the lakes in Washington is a little tough. And so I think coming up with, and I think this is a good place for WALPA. We've talked about this on the volunteer monitoring side of things, of actually collecting not just water measurements, but user information, right? Finding out who's there, putting them in touch with information about their lake, where would they find it, right? So trying to get volunteers to kind of expand the reach of, and I know that Snohomish County already and King County already do this, but I think that there's a bunch of lakes that we don't reach, especially those that don't have that kind of that population that it's usually the lake homeowners as opposed to people that are using the lake. And so the question is, are you actually getting in contact with other people using the lake, or are they just getting in contact with people that live on the lake? So Avery and I have been trying to figure out, how do you reach that population? How do you get them informed? How do you find out who they are? And I do wonder if WALPA members who are out there, one of the things I find is when I'm out on a lake, I'm always getting questions from people. Usually it's, what did you catch? Which is interesting because it's the one thing we don't bring out on a lake is a fishing pole when we're out sampling, but it doesn't matter. And it gives us an opportunity to talk to people, whoever happens to be there. So just kind of working with WALPA members to maybe put together a survey that they can do whenever they happen to be out on a lake and they're doing, kind of doing a quick thing along those lines, and set up a regular piece that at least tells us what are the communities that we should be trying to reach, what languages should we be trying to use out there. And I think that's at least one place to start, but it's definitely, at least as far as I've found, there's not a simple answer for kind of a broader brush of figuring out all of the lakes, what's going on.
And you're right about that. There's no simple answer. Yeah, I feel like we've done, the committee that I'm on is incredibly in tune and cerebral with what's going on the ground. And we've done some really incredible, in-depth kind of a sociological, qualitative, quantitative study on our community and what they want and how they utilize it. And we've done some, simple things such as count the people in the park that day, that night, and what they're doing, like what the activity is, or what they want to do too. We feel compelled or we feel comfortable, and we've kind of assessed from afar the social cue. You get the head nod, like, hey, how's it going? What's going on? Hey, I was wondering, what are your favorite things you like to do at the park? And we start to create, from these like dialogues, we start to create a repository of what people like to do. And then at the same time, we start to put that in a hierarchical order. And what people want to learn to do is fish, because somehow they've learned about the daylighting project at Bear Shuttle Park, where we won a fantastic grant on restoring the Chinook habitat on the lower end of Lake Washington, and what that means for the community. So a lot of people want to learn how to fish. They want to learn how to canoe. They want to learn how to swim. These are grown people, many of them adults, some of them in their 60s, want to learn how to swim. And there's no room for that at our park currently. So again, it's just kind of having those authentic conversations with the community and really figuring out what they want. And I feel like that's been effective. And then you turn that into something official, right? Like a document to maybe submit to have your proof that increases your clout, right, on winning. But yeah, it's been so much fun talking to me, like, what do you want? What do you like to do? You like to fish? Oh, you don't know how to fish, but you want to know? Okay, that's cool.
That's outstanding. And I would love to see use that as an example, maybe for something that Jim is talking about, where we can maybe adapt from what you've learned in that really extensive project. Not every lake has such an engaged community group as Link to Lake. But maybe that's something we can draw from to make a bigger sort of exemplar survey of how you might go about talking to people at these lakes, which would be awesome. I don't want to cut that off if people have other things to say about it, but we have a couple of comments coming in that actually relate to a question I was going to pose specifically to Marissa, but then to anybody, which is generally about the relationship between private ownership on lakefront and public use on lakefront. So the first comment we got was about lake residents sort of actively discouraging public access, even on public land. And so I know you have worked, Marissa, through Lakewise with some of that. So I wonder if you could lead us off talking about some of the sort of known conflicts or the things that tend to antagonize that relationship, or kind of what you've learned about that in Snohomish County.
Sure. So we often, as Jim says, we do work a lot with lake residents because they are our target group for improving water quality by changing behaviors. And we also work with them in terms of volunteer monitors. But we also do get a flavor from the public, because when there are issues and lake users, they call us about if there's issues with the boat launches and other things. And I think after Avery's intro, I did a quick survey of ours, and our 35 public lakes that we work with in the county, 15 have parks that are accessible that allow swimming or other things, whereas the remaining 20 just have a boat launch. And I think right there, the boat launch is probably the biggest source of conflict. And I think Ashley alluded to this as well, is boat launches really aren't set up for multi-use recreation. They're set up for people to pull in a boat and go fishing. And so there's a lot of tension that comes, because especially when you have more dense population, or even if it's just a hot summer day, you're going to have, 20 people trying to get in their floaties to go out swimming or fishing, or little kids waiting in the park as people are trying to launch. And so that definitely creates a tension and a conflict. But I think along with that too, from a lake resident perspective, as I mentioned, a lot of our lakes that are in rural areas, there's not a lot of people around there, especially in the evening. And so boat launches become a hub or an activity, a place where people get really concerned about for vandalism, trash, and particularly drug use and leaving needles behind. So there's a lot of concern about public health and safety that's generated. And Fish and Wildlife, they have a really low budget, and it's very hard for them to keep up on cleaning the access sites and that sort of thing. So we've seen a lot of partnerships with lake residents, doing frequent cleanups of the boat launches and other things. Some of them pretend to lock the gate each night. They close it to try and discourage people, though it's not really actually locked. So there's been a lot of conflict around that. I think one thing we haven't really talked about either is there's this perception, or in some cases, real potential concerns about the lake health with regard to lake users. And one of the biggest ones, which is a real threat, not to say lake users or residents can't bring in, but aquatic invasive species. Boats coming in are often the source of those aquatic invasive species. And once they're introduced, it's often the residents that end up footing the bill if there is any action taken on them. So that is one kind of area of conflict. Another one that may in some ways be more of a perceived threat. In some cases, it might be a real threat, but we did a survey of lake residents for kind of separate purposes. But in that, we asked what their main thought was for the main sources of pollution to the lake. And 22% of them said the main source of pollution was lake recreation from external users. And then there is also on boats with expensive motorized boat access, there's a lot of conflict that arises too there in terms of the noise pollution, and especially with the advent of wake boats, there's been really concern about that. So that's not necessarily to do with lake access and some of the things we're talking about, but these are the reasons that I think, Avery, your point in that question that comes in, oftentimes there is a conflict with lake residents, and they are vocally against expanding lake access. Not always, but there definitely is tension and concern there.
We have a couple of follow-up comments from viewers as well about specifically about if anyone has had experience with signage or communication to assert the rights of the public in public spaces, to sort of state the rights of the commons in those common spaces. And then a separate question, but somewhat related, about community docks, where there may be a public access point only accessible to like a homeowners association or lake association members, and whether there's kind of what the history of those are. This is a question specifically referencing Lake Sammamish and the Sammamish Plateau, where there are some community docks that are not privately owned, but are only accessible to certain people. So if anyone knows anything about the history of those, and or any experience with good signage to explain the rights of access in different places.
I can address the second one about the private docks. So a lot of times what's happened is developers may be able to only acquire like one lakefront parcel, but they want to build a huge development behind it. So what happens is then people purchase into that larger development and then are granted specific rights to those docks. So that's often where that comes from. So each person owns, 1/100th or something of that community dock, and that's why they're restricted. And when we see that on bigger lakes here, at least most of the time, those are gated and locked to only allow members into those areas. I'm assuming that's what that's referring to. I'm not familiar with the Sammamish example, though.
I think that, yeah, that sounds like the very little familiarity I have with Lake Sammamish. That sounds like the right answer. Has anyone seen any signage or thought about signage about commons? I can imagine this particularly with the kind of pocket park model on Lake Washington. So Daniel, I don't know if you have any experience with that.
I have not seen a lot of signage like that. There is occasionally something that will say like public shore, but usually the signs say no. Signs are all about saying, you know, this is only for members and residents of this homeowners association if it's one of those private dock things. So, no, as Ashley was talking about with Bereshiva, what tells people it's a park is usually not a sign, it's the way that the space is set up and used that it invites that. Usually the only places I see signs saying something about public access is when it's like an easement through private land and they have to basically say, you're allowed to be on the trail, but this is private land. And so it's still kind of asserting that privateness of it. Yeah, public land usually has pretty poor signage. So trying to find a park even, sometimes I've been driving around a lake, it's like, okay, well, the map says there's a park here. I'm looking at it, I'm still not sure.
Yeah, I really like the idea, and I want to go on like a ninja campaign to put like "yes, you can" signs all over public parks now. I really like
that would be delightful.
I think maybe that's the actionable item that should come from this discussion.
Avery, I might add to that an actionable item too. I don't know why I never thought of this before, but is improving that signage to our lakes. We have one lake, Chain Lake in Snohomish County, that we literally, when people call, say you have to look for the blue reflector by the road and take a left because otherwise you'll miss it because it looks like you're driving down somebody's driveway, but it ends up being a public access site. So that's a really simple action. I mean, it's expensive, and Fish and Wildlife, it's difficult, but it's actionable.
Yeah, that's great. We have a little bit of a related question then coming in about how people perceive lakes. So the question is sort of, as we talk to communities and people around the lakes, have we all encountered a sense mostly of, from not so much homeowners, but public using the lake, that we belong to this lake and this lake is ours to steward, this lake is ours to use? Or do you encounter more of a perception of this lake is theirs, meaning it belongs to the managers, it belongs to the state, or even it belongs to homeowners, and I'm just visiting. And that maybe has to do with some of that, you know, whether we tend to speak of keeping people out or inviting people in. But what do you see mostly, that people feel the lake is theirs, or that they're visiting someone else's place when you talk to the public?
I mean, we haven't done an official survey or anything, but we see a lot of people as we go sample and post and that sort of thing and talk to them. And I think for the most part, that people feel that public lands are theirs. I mean, again, that's my community. It's that I work with are mostly in rural areas and that sort of thing. But we, you know, I think people do feel a sense of ownership if they've made it and have figured out that that lake is there for them. I think our bigger issue is probably the people that aren't aware of them and trying to increase that. But once they're there, for the most part, people do feel ownership over that, of, you know, their ability to go kayak or swim or even just fish or even pick blackberries in the boat launch parking lot. We see a lot of that. And it's especially, yeah, I think there's some ownership there just from our conversations.
It's Jim. I think some of the ownership comes with the size of the access too, or the sort of ability for access, right? That, you know, some of the lakes I go to, it's chain link fence on either side, warning signs from the neighbors, and a boat ramp, or even just gravel going into the lake. And that's a whole different feel to ownership, right? And I think there's a different, you can see sort of that difference in how they feel than, you know, someplace like Angle Lake or Steel Lake, where you have these larger parks and lots of people feeling like it's their space to go spread out, have fun, right? It feels that kind of public access feel. And so I think that there's can be a difference in how people.
And then there's a follow-up question to that about if anyone has any ideas for strategies or tools for sort of increasing that sense of connection or ownership to water bodies by people who are not lake shore owners. If anyone wants to speak to that, some of it might just be taking down the chain link fencing.
I think that Jim just maybe kind of nailed it right there. Is most of our public access sites are really boat launches, and some of those are so physically constrained, I'm not sure they can become anything else. But there are some out there that would allow for expansion and invitation. And I think in terms of the strategies, there are some grant funding sources out there to improve public access. And I imagine, squeaky wheels get the grease. So those people that are really pushing for it have probably historically been at the more affluent lakes and other things for improved areas. And so maybe working with some of the major funding sources like the RCO, the Recreation and Conservation Office, I think that's right, that runs those grant programs to maybe have a category specific to areas that are traditionally underserved, potentially could be a strategy to move forward and apply funding for those. Or potentially it's WALPA identifying a few ones and encouraging the community to apply for these funding sources or partner with them, or partner organizations within WALPA might be one idea.
Yeah, I think it comes back down to the signage again, and also capitalizing on the aesthetics too, to increase belongingness. I do think the visitors that come and stroll, the ones who do know about Bear Shepherd Park and the Waterfront Access, they feel like they own it, but I don't know who said it on the panel, but it's so small though. The ownership is so small, so it's just also connects to like power and like what you're worth in regards to being in that small space with your friend or with your niece or with your children. So the beautification piece, I think, is very impactful, and that's definitely neglected at the southern end of Lake Washington. I think that needs to be paid attention to and really increase the use of it, and increase the sense of belongingness and wanting to just stay there long periods of time. Because this boat launch situation is such a stratification between different demographics and people, and that kind of discourages people to want to stay when there's a boat coming into the water. I don't know, boats are awesome, but at the same time, for me, when I see it, I see wealth, and they don't have those things. And two, like when we go back to the definitions and stuff, I've talked to someone about like a beach, and like, I don't understand. How is this a beach? There's no sand. I don't want to go. There's no sand. That's a great, and I was talking to them about, I study like the geological and like habitat attributes of sockeye salmon in Alaska, and I talk about like habitat. What does habitat look like? What is it? What attracts you to a habitat? What attracts you to a space? And that was something that was interesting, where they criticized negatively about the substrate on the ground. They wanted sand, so that was something that was like a detrimental impact on some certain subpopulations on wanting to use the beach, which was interesting and overlooked.
Another piece of that is, do people feel safe there? I don't know as much if there's been good research on lake access specifically, but for urban parks and green spaces, there's been a lot of research on what makes a space feel safe and inviting to a community. And you can have all the signs you want, but if they don't feel like it's a safe spot. So just signs that a place is being kept and cared for, that there's designated things. There's even been some fun studies with like prairie restoration type projects in the Midwest, where they find that if they just mow a little strip around the edge and put up a cute little fence, suddenly people see it as beautiful and well-loved and inviting, as opposed to overgrown and vacant and derelict. So it can be a few little things like that. But then also, is there lighting at night? Are there lines of sight so that people don't feel like someone's going to jump out from around a bush? Any of those bits. So there's a fair bit about just urban park design that I think could be helpful here. Again, at a boat launch, we may have absolutely nothing to work with, but for places where we do, does it feel like someone cares for it? And are there other people around to have those eyes on the ground kind of thing? There's a lot out there on what can make a space feel safe, comfortable, and inviting.
I think along with that, with one of the things that maybe is ignored here too is, when we do have our parks here in Snohomish County, and they're mostly on lakes within cities, and the cities tend to take care of and have that feel of being loved. But the Fish and Wildlife Access parks and launches, they're not very well taken care of, and it's not really the fault of Fish and Wildlife. They are stretched so thin. I know the manager here that works on that cleaning, and he does a tremendous amount of work and is always out doing it, but simply they right now don't have the resources to take care and manage those public access sites like they are kind of deserve to be. So some solution may be either addressing the underlying funding sources for the care of our public properties in the state. And on top of that, when that's not feasible, is developing partnerships and working with those lake landowners. They can be used as a resource. We've seen that a lot where when they've adopted an area, that public access site is so much more inviting, clear of trash, clear of debris and blackberries and that thing. And so they can be a real asset, and working with them to, make everybody feel welcome.
I think what making it inviting is also about actually sending out invitations, right? So I think that, one of the things that we happen in summer is there's usually like, it shows up in the newspaper, or old school, shows up in print, or it actually shows up on your phone. But where to go? But it tends to be, go to Lake Roosevelt, right? Or go someplace that's way away from where you actually live, and requires money and access and things that people don't have, as opposed to here's all the different places in your neighborhood, right? Not one place in the county or something, but where are all the access points, right? Letting people in on the spots that they can go to, and kind of giving them that access is that's a big invitation. It's just to say, here's where we're recommending that you can go and, near you to actually find some great places when it gets hot in the summertime. And then the other piece is about spending effort and money on working on those places that where people need the most access, right? So in places where finances are low and access to green space is really needed, we tend to write off water bodies, unfortunately, for the things that they're needed most, right? So when it's getting hot during climate change issues, people are looking for the space, but, in Wapato Lake in Pierce County, you can walk around it, but you can't go swimming in it. If, some bunch of those places that have public access, it's only near the water at certain times of the summer. You can't actually get in the water. And so I think that there's a need to create those inviting spaces and actually make them usable in the way that people need them. And so I think that's, again, what Ashley and Daniel and other folks were talking about, is trying to get information on what people would use them for, not necessarily what they use them for now. And it's somewhat of a chicken and an egg thing, because the people that are there are probably using it for what they can do right now, as opposed to thinking about what they would do with them sometimes. So how do you get a hold of those people that want to use it for something else?
That's
I
great.
just want to say one quick thing, if possible. And I think everyone touched on it. I really do, is that I think it's incredibly important and vital to have a participatory approach to this. They have to be at the round table. I'm a firm believer in citizen science, right? And there's some incredible informal scientists out there who have incredible ideas, innovative ideas, forward-thinking ideas that could be included on how to be effective on going about this and creating more access points, and be in charge of maybe the design of the light fixtures that need to be installed at the beaches. It's just really neat to have an eclectic bunch of people together to come up with a solid plan. I think it becomes way more robust and impactful in the long run. So I just wanted to say that it's all about like collective action on this.
That's great. We have just a short time left, and there's questions coming in from the audience that we probably don't have time to get to, but I just want to mention there's a couple of comments talking about both the signage related to things like, as in Daniel's example with the prairies, things like signage that helps people discern between something like a restoration project and something being overgrown or neglected, where we have things that might be growing back or might be, pulled of vegetation for a short time while something's ongoing. Things like where sandy beaches are and aren't appropriate in terms of lake health or the lake function, and some of the things, especially in small spaces, maybe the potential conflict between very heavy use and the environmental needs of the lake. And so the questions we can continue to dwell on. In the just 5 minutes that we have left, I want to give them a chance to take a quick break before we go to the student posters. So just really quickly, I want to think about what WALPA's role in this might be, right? We don't have huge pots of money that we can give to these things. We don't have necessarily all the resources to solve this, but we do have an amazing network, right? There's people out here watching from counties across the state, from all sorts of different agencies, from different research bodies, from different community groups. What is something you think that we could do within this organization that would be helpful to this question? I think going forward, if we were to take something and move forward with it, what do you think something effective could be? And we'll try to make this just really quick if everybody has one quick comment before we end.
Like you said, just networking. Honestly, I've been looking for a community organization just like Ashley's. I didn't know her existed until we ended up on the same panel today. So I'll be reaching out to you for some ongoing partnership stuff. But yeah, if WALPA can just help with the matchmaking.
I think the question is WALPA, I'm not muted. I was trying to say that WALPA doesn't have a lot of money, but we can and have successfully influenced policy decisions in the past. So if there was one policy decision, whether it be with the state or something like that, that could really help to make this change, if we could carefully, maybe collaboratively, participatorily think of what that policy change would be, a very actionable item, and go for it, that's probably, besides the networking component, our best bet.
Jim or Ashley, do you have a final thought?
Just building those bridges would be fantastic. You all are fantastic for what you do. And it's been wonderful to meet you on this panel. But yeah, building bridges, expanding networks.
I do think, similar to what Marissa's saying, is I think WALPA, it's a good thing for WALPA to get into on the policy side and try to figure out if there are ways to fund some things along, volunteer monitoring and volunteer actions or recognition for people who go and maintain these public spaces, who send out flyers about this, who are collecting information. Seems like trying to get kind of working that angle to really develop a statewide program is definitely needed, and something that WALPA can coordinate across the state.
Great. Well, thank you all. I want to give a couple of minutes to let the media transition to the next session. So I think that I'm seeing that the session will restart again at 9:05 for the student posters. So everyone out there in TV land, YouTube land that's watching, take a quick break and get some coffee and come back to see those students and their work. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us this morning. Thank you for all of your thoughts.